Hi, this is Gayle with BERNINA of Naperville, and happy October. That's right, happy October 25th, everybody, because we finally got around to making our cute Fat Quarter Club project for October. And you know what? I think you're all gonna totally be on board with the fact that it was worth the wait. We are making an Itabag. And for those of you that might not know what that is, it's actually like a little protective pin bag where you can put all of your favorite buttons and badges and figurines and sewing pins, those enamel pins and all of that in a bag, and then be rest assured that if one falls off, it doesn't fall out of the bag. See, the Ita bags originated in Japan, and they're mostly in the anime manga genre. Like, you'll see these bags made up of any shape, all different kinds of styles, and people who are fans of this genre will collectively keep their pins in maybe not one bag, but two bags, but three bags, or whatever. And so I thought it was only fitting to take some of the pins that I've been collecting through my sewing career. I mean, every year at Bernina University, there's an enamel pin that comes out. I just have a ton. So I am making mine out of some fun sewing fabric and a little bit of clear vinyl and some stabilizers. Now the pattern isn't ours. It came from Erica Malvina, from our friend, the blogger for Bernina's blog, weallsew.com. And she made a really lovely one out of wool, but we thought we'd jazz ours up a bit. Now we did make a few little alterations to ours that are a little bit different than Erica's, but that's okay, because you know what? Sewing is all about being creative and making it the way that you want to make it, right? Well, let's just have a deep dive and see what's going on here. In addition to our fabric, we are also going to need some webbing. Now, this is the 1.5-inch wide Tula Pink webbing, and we recently got in 1-inch solid webbing from her, but the pattern that Erica designed actually calls for 1.5-inch. So we have 1.5-inch slider and some rectangular hardware that will help attach this bag to the sides. And then the clear vinyl that I'm using is from OESD. And this, I love this stuff. It's really nice. It doesn't crumple. You don't need to press it. It comes in a nice roll on the tube. You're going to love it. And we only need a very small piece. Then we're also going to be using some Pellon. And this is the 72F. It's the Peltex. And the Peltex is what we're going to pin our pins to. Then we're also going to be using the Craft Fuse. And the Craft Fuse, I think it's number 808 from Pellon, but this is just going to make the fabric a little bit stiff. Then we're going to be using some fusible fleece, and this is also a Pellon product, and I used this on the outside of the bag just because I still wanted it to have like a soft look, but if you wanted a more harder look to your bag, you could also use the Craft Fuse for the outer fabric and the inner fabric. You probably want to talk about the cutting. So from the small sewing machine fabric in our kit, we want to cut from the outer bag one 13-inch by 16-inch piece. Now, the width of the bag is the 13-inch side, so if you care to arrange fabric directionally, keep this in mind. But because we had a lot going on with this bag, I decided not to pay too much attention to the directional orientation of the bag. But the outer bag fabric, whichever you choose from our Fat Quarter pack, you're going to cut 13 inches by 16-inch piece. And for the outer piece, we're going to fuse that with the fusible fleece so that it has this nice soft hand to it. And from the green fabric that has the little spool cap tops that's super cute, from that we're going to cut one 13-inch by 16-inch piece. Same advice as for our outer fabric, but this time we're going to fuse this with the Craft Fuse so that it stays relatively stiff. Then we have a lime green and pink spool fabric, and one of them is for the outer and one is for the inner. Now this is where we deviate a little bit from Erica's instructions because I'm opting to line these pieces. So for instance, whatever you use on the outer flap, you're going to cut one 11 by 11 inch square, and then your fuse only whatever you're choosing to go around your vinyl with the craft fuse. Now the reason that we blocked this, that's when you take a piece of fabric that you're going to cut down later, but you fuse the interfacing onto it first. That's called blocking. And you see this happen a lot in apparel construction with interfacings and things like that. But we have this 11 inch by 11 inch outer piece that I just thought was fun. And you know, with these fat quarter of the month projects, I like to keep things very scrappy. But now we want to cut these up. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to cut a piece. We're going to cut two pieces, 1.5 inches by 11 inches. So here's our first piece. And now we're going to cut another piece, 1.5 inches. Then we're going to cut another piece that's 3.5 inches wide. And then we're going to put this aside. We're going to put this aside, and we're going to take one of our 1.5 inch pieces, and we're going to cut those into two 5.5 inch strips. Now this is where we deviate a little bit from Erica's instructions because I'm opting to line these pieces. So for the other piece that's just going to be the lining, you don't need to put any interfacing or anything on that, but you're still going to cut that 11 inch square into 1.5 inch strip, two 1.5 by 5.5 inch strips, and a 3.5 by 11 inch piece. So I made a couple of little adjustments to this bag, nothing big. I don't want to put the Velcro on. This has a really long flap, and I'm just not going to put it on. If you want to put the Velcro on, don't forget that I'm including a link to Erica's original blog post from weallsew.com in here, so you can do it just like hers, and her instructions are perfect, okay? But another thing that I wanted to do, rather than zigzag and turn my edges over for the lining pieces, I opted to line the lining pieces. And I did that simply by cutting 11 inches by 16 and 11 here by 5. Now, another thing, and I'll put this in the handout that we create additionally too, okay? Now, another thing with this is anytime that you're lining something by folding it, you know, cutting a long piece and folding, you have to deal a little bit with any kind of fabric that might be directional. This is directional. And one of the things that the great debate here, right, is do we seam it up here so that we can read needle and pins right here going across this way, or do we kind of cut it sideways? So I did the same thing on our lining with my little thread spool caps. I decided to just make it sideways rather than adding additional seam, which would add additional bulk. So that's why my little needles and pins is going sideways, but also, you know, ultimately those pins are going to cover this area here, so we don't have to be that careful. Then from the aqua spool fabric, this is for our pin display board. You're going to cut two 7-inch by 10-inch pieces, no stabilizer. Now, if we look down here on our cutting instructions, the strapping pieces, basically two 4-inch pieces, and then from whatever's left, which is approximately 62 inches, that's going to be your strap of your bag. From the stabilizers, even though I gave you the instructions for how you're going to fuse it, if you are somebody that needs to know exactly what you're going to cut for the stabilizers, I've laid this out for you. And don't forget that this particular handout that I'm going through is available in the description of this video. It's also available on our Bernina of Naperville website, BERNINAofNaperville.com, in the product description of our Fat Quarter Club. So for marking, basically you're going to take your outer piece that has the fusible fleece on it and your lining piece with the green spools, and you're going to turn these pieces over and you're going to mark down the center. And that's going to be that line's going to be the 13-inch line. And what that means is that's going to be kind of the bottom of your bag. So you're going to draw a line down that piece, and then 1 inch away from that line, And it's 1.5 inch up from the raw edge and then 1 inch over. And we're going to make this mark on either side of the bag, lining, and outer piece. And this is just an easy way to help us box the bottom of this bag. And we're boxing the lining and we're boxing the outer piece. So now we're ready to sew this together. And we're going to take our outer piece first. And we're going to line up the top raw edges together. And then we're going to line up those markings that we made down at the bottom of the bag. And I do it by pinning and pinning at the top. Now, I'm not a huge pinner, so I don't use a ton of pins, but sometimes it's important to kind of have some pins in there for reference. So lining up those drawn lines together, putting a little pin in, and then making sure that the top is aligned and pinning that as well. And all seam allowances are 1/2 inch. Even on the lining, that we're also going to fold up exactly the same way, lining up the drawn lines. That's going to help us with boxing each one of these pieces at the bottom. And just so you know, even a bent pin is good sometimes. I mean, look at that thing. Yeah, you know what? I'm not going to bother to discard it. I'm using it. And then you can see on this other side, we're going to give that a little encouragement with a pin. That one's straight. So over on my sewing machine, I actually have some Orifil thread threaded up in the top and bottom, and yes, it's pink. I kind of like the pink thread on this. I've got like a little bit of pink elements in it, and I just thought, you know what the heck. So I am lining up my fabric with my 1/2 inch mark, and if we get in here just a little bit closer, we're going to see that we actually have a 1/2 inch line right on our needle plate. And I do a reverse stitch at the beginning and end, and I pull those bent pins out of my way when I'm stitching, but you can see that 1/2 inch is 1 notch closer to the foot than the 5/8 of an inch mark. And then when we get to the edge, we're going to remove our pin. We're going to go sew right to the edge and back tack and use our thread cutter if you have one to cut. And we're going to do that on both sides of our lining and both sides of our outer fabric. When we are getting our outer piece, because we have a little bit of floof on it, I'm using the side of my 97D foot because it's about 3/8 of an inch. And that side of the foot, I'm lining it up right so that it's right on that seam, and I've pressed my seams open. I'm going to just line that foot right up against that edge so my pressed open seams will lay nice and flat and be pretty. And I'm going to sew as close as I can down to that seam or down to the corner. I mean, it's going to be impossible for me to get all the way to the corner, but I'm just going to sew as far as I can. And then once I get as far as I think I can without doing any kind of damage, I'm going to use my knee lever to lift my foot, stitch across, and I think it's about 5 stitches is 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to sew 5 stitches to that seam, and then 5 stitches more, and then pivot and go back down this piece. And then this keeps everything nice and pretty. But I'm just going to stitch and cut and do the same thing on the other side. And then I also did this on the lining as well, even though I'm not sure I would have needed to. And then remember our little markings that we did for boxing. So here is my outer piece, and I'm taking that blue marking line and lining it up with the other blue marking line on the back, and I'm just going to stitch down the seam, reinforcing it. So stitch forward, backwards, forwards over the seam, back tack, and then we're going to cut. And then I always trim just 1/4 of an inch away from that sewn line. Now remember our vinyl pieces. Well, it's time to stitch these on. So I'm not using a vinyl foot. or nonstick foot, I'm just simply taking our vinyl. Now let's take a moment because we are cutting the vinyl 5.5 inches by 9 inches. And along each short side, that's the 5-inch side, I have a lining piece, the vinyl, and the interfaced piece. And I stick my hand underneath so that nothing sticks to the bottom of my sewing machine. And I'm just going to carefully stitch down this edge. And I did do this with 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you might have to find your groove a little bit as you feed this through, but because the vinyl is kind of stiff as well. But I'm going to trim and then turn this around and sew the other pieces on the other side. So once you've sewn to both 5.5 inch sides of this, you're going to finger press your fabrics and add the top, which is that 3.5 inch piece, sandwiching that vinyl in just as you did on the sides. And once again, I'm using the 1/4 inch seam allowance for this. And you can see that vinyl sandwiched in there nicely. And now I'm going to pull that piece back and fold it together. And I'm just going to hit this with my iron just a little bit, but not touch the vinyl. And sometimes it's just heating up the fabric just enough that'll do the trick. And then if you have a clapper, which I love my multiple purpose clapper here that you see me using, I will keep that seam nice and flat, and then everything looks perfectly pressed. Now I just need to add that 1.5 inch strip to the bottom, and our first part of our flap is complete. And this stitches on just like any of the other sides that we did. And once again, you can see that in this project, you don't necessarily need a non-stick foot because we are encapsulating our vinyl in between two pieces of cotton. Once the main part of the flap is together, it's time to put those lining pieces on. And the larger one is going to go on first. So we're going to turn our vinyl piece that we just created so that we are seeing it right sides up. And we're going to put the larger piece lining the bottom pieces up. Now I want to take a moment to say I'm doing this a little bit different than Erica because our pieces are cut the same width as the flap. So we're not adding any extra depth to the pocket. I didn't think it was necessary. Then we're going to put the skinny piece on the top. And we're going to stitch around the three sides, the sides and the bottom. And once again, I'm over at my sewing machine and I'm aligning everything so that everything matches up nicely. And if you are a pinner, pin. If you like to use fabric clips, use fabric clips. I am neither one of those things. I just throw caution to the wind and stitch. And I'm using 1/4 inch seam allowance on this. And then when you get to the corner, you're going to stop 1/4 inch from the edge, pivot, and stitch. Make sure that I'm keeping my hand under the work just so nothing sticks to the stainless bed of my sewing machine. And this can be a little challenging, but just take it slow. And then once again, stopping 1/4 inch away from the edge to pivot. And then just make sure that your flap is nice and flat. And then once you're done, you're gonna turn your work inside out. And I use my little weird metal turning tube for this. I do prefer my OESD Expert turning wand, but I don't have that at home, so I have my other one that I don't even know where I got this thing. but you're going to poke out your corners, get everything nice and flat, and then it's up to you whether or not you would like to stitch 1/4 of an inch from this edge around your flap. I found that I needed to hold my pins in nicely. And so once you have it assembled, you're also going to make sure that you baste at the top to hold everything in the bag and keeps everything nice and flat. And then once you have your outside piece and your inside lining pieces complete, it's time for us to attach our webbing pieces. So we're going to visit these little tabs that we cut, the 4-inch pieces, and you're going to fold them over your D-ring or your rectangular ring, but you're not going to fold it in half. See how I've kind of, one side is a little bit shorter and one side's a little bit longer, and we're going to fold that for both. Then we're going to take our outer piece and we're going to measure 1.5 inches down on either side right on the seam line. And this is where you're going to line up the very top of your metal hardware, not the ribbon, but your actual metal hardware. And I'm just using my cutting mat to line up these measurements. Once we're at the machine, I'm going to change out my 4D, which is a zipper foot. And I will have to move my needle position over. And once I lift up that dual feed to disengage my foot, put my number 4 foot on. I love these Bernina feet because they're one-handtastic. I'm going to move the needle all the way over to the right. And that's 5 clicks to the right. And you don't want to forget to actually tell the machine that you've got the zipper foot number 4D on. So wrap your material or your webbing around that ring, and then I'm just going to start stitching, and I'm going to stitch a few stitches, go backwards, then come forward, and then go backwards again. And that's going to hold that piece on there snug, and I'm going to repeat that process for the other D-ring. Fold the little flap up so that the raw edges meet, and then that is how you are going to place that on the side of your bag. And I am now freeing my free arm so I can get my bag around my long piece of my free arm there on my machine. And now I'm just going to get that spot. You're going to center it and line that metal piece up with the line that you marked. Place my work in the center right on that marked line. And then using my zipper foot still, I'm going to stitch right on top of that stitching line that I just stitched. And in this case, I'm going to stitch a little box around this piece to hold it on. So, you've seen this on, I'm sure, backpacks and other bags. And I'm just going to stitch around the perimeter of this square, kind of using the right side of my zipper foot as a guide, honestly. Stopping with my needle in the down position and pivoting. I am using my freehand system to raise and lower my presser foot for this. And now when I get back to where I started, I'm going to stitch up to that point, stop, and then I'm going to pivot, but I'm going to aim for the corner of the box so I can make this little X right through my webbing. This strap is going nowhere, ladies and gentlemen. And then I do just back up or over sew just a little bit after I do this X. And then I'm going to use the thread cutter to cut my threads. And just repeat this process on the other side of the bag. Now, what I want to do is take our lining piece, and I'm just going to fold this back like 1/2 inch and press. And the reason why I'm doing this is I just want to kind of give a little crease to define a stitching line. We are actually going to sew this in by the machine. I think Erica's instructions tell you to stitch this, like top stitch this, but I'm going to stitch it in the seam with the flap and everything. But I need to, massage this a little bit so that we just have this folded over 1/2 inch, pressed and creased. Then we're going to take our flap that we've prepared, that's been all stitched and nice, and we're going to find the center of our bag, and just one side is fine. And then we're going to find the center of our flap, and we're going to line those up together and pin. And you're pinning from the center out on both sides. And you can see how it's going to look when we fold it over. So when we go over to the machine, we're taking off that number 4D foot and we're replacing it with our number 97D. And I'm just going to stitch this into place with a, like a seam allowance slightly less than the 1/2 inch seam allowance that we're using. Don't forget to move that needle position back to the center. And then we also don't want to sew over our pins, but I'm just going to line this up just a shade less than a 1/2 inch. Pull your pins before you stitch over them, and then tack, cut, and move on with the next step. And now there's my lining piece that's been folded over. So now I'm just going to shove my outer bag into my lining, just like this, lining up the side seams right on that seam, putting a pin in, and I'm going to pin all the way around the bag. But what I'm going to do is on the front part of the bag, the part that does not have that flap, I'm going to leave about an 8-inch opening so I can turn my bag inside out after this step. So there's that opening that we're going to leave, and you can see there it was a little bit higgledy-piggledy, so I just redistributed the bulk. And now when I go over to the machine with the free arm still exposed, I'm going to start at that one pin right in the front, and I'm going to make sure that I back tack right in front of the pin. I didn't stitch over it. And now this time at exactly a 1/2 inch, we're going to stitch. And making sure that underneath of the bag that, we have everything, all the bulk equally distributed to prevent puckering. And now as I go around this, I just want to remind you if there's any items that you've seen in this video or any supplies that you need, these are all available at BERNINA.com. You can also download the handout that's in the description of this video, and I have links in that handout to all the products we've used. And now there's my stopping point on this bag. I'm going to remove my pin, cut my thread, and turn my bag inside out and press, being careful not to melt that vinyl on the flap. And then once you get it turned inside out, we're going to take our pins and pin that opening over with our folded edge, everything nice and flat and pretty. And I like these magic pins because the head of them is made of silicone, so I can actually take this over to the iron and press this while it's pinned without danger of melting the pin heads. And that's starting to look really good. So now we're going to turn our attention to the remainder of our strapping, and this is our slider. So we're going to slip our webbing through the slider, and we're going to fold that over just like we did on our other pieces, pin it into place, and stitch our little box, just like we did with the side pieces, but this time you don't really need to use the zipper foot. You can just use your number 97D foot. Once you've made your strapping, you just simply need to loop it in to one side of your bag, just like that. I'm doing it on the left side. And then you're going to take this piece and you're going to weave it through the slider. And this is going to make it adjustable because you might want it to be a shoulder bag or maybe a crossbody. So this gives you some options. And then once we do this, we want to make sure that we carefully don't twist our strapping. And then we're going to take that other end and loop it around the right side of the bag. And just like we did before, we're going to fold it under and place it and stitch. Once again, stitching the little square. And once you've stitched your strapping on, you can go ahead and stitch your bag piece down. This is also going to be the seam that encloses that opening in the front of our bag where we turned it. And so I am just using the inside of the right toe of my 97D foot, but you could put on your number 10D foot at this point and line that little edge stitch piece on that edge stitch foot just where you need it. But I found that this was satisfactory for this project. And we want to make sure that we remove the pins again and that we stitch close enough to the edge here so that it holds everything nicely, but not far enough away that, it looks sloppy. So we're about just a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch away from these folded edges here where there was no stitching here previously. Once you're around the bag, it's time to cut the Peltex 6 by 9 inches. And then we're going to take those spool fabrics and we're going to put one up wrong side up, and we're going to center our Peltex in the middle just like that, so we can see that we have about 1/2 inch all the way around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch my spool fabric together, right sides together, leaving the top open to turn. Once I stitched, I trim my little corners there and then turn it inside out. And then hopefully you will have no problem squeezing your little Peltex piece in there. You're going to gently fold the little edges over, and you can give it a little bit of a pressing. I just finger press at this point. And then I am going to slip my Peltex piece inside. Once we get everything placed in there nicely and flat, we can take our 97D foot and do that same 1/8 of an inch stitching, edge stitching away from the edge. And then Erica recommends that at the top of this piece that you stitch about 1 inch away, kind of giving you a guideline of where to put your pins. I actually found that I wouldn't have needed to do that. My pins were all quite visible nicely, but that's an option if you choose to do it that way. And then once this is done, baby, it's time to put those pins on there. And I have to tell you, I think I might need another bag to put all of my pins in. But it came out great. I love it. And oops, forgot to put the enamel Bernina of Naperville pin in there. All right, well, look at that. It's super cute. We love it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this exercise. I hope you enjoyed this project. And as always, don't forget, you can always sign up for the Fat Quarter of the Month Club. It's easy and there's no obligation. You just hop on over to BERNINAofNaperville.com, find our Fat Quarter Club, and there you can sign up. Now, you will receive an invoice from us once a month, but we're not taking automatic payment. It's just up to you whether you want to pay or not. You like the project, you pay for it. You don't want the project, you don't pay for it. Nobody's feelings will be hurt. All right, well, one more thing, if you like this tutorial and you want to see more, hop on over to our YouTube channel. It's easy. It's youtube.com/BERNINA of Naperville, and there you can like, comment, and subscribe. Happy sewing.